What was the worst hurricane in U.S. history?
Hurricane Katrina, which hit the Gulf Coast in late August 2005. Was not only the most disastrous hurricane in U.S. history, it was the nation's worst single weather disaster. Though not the strongest possible hurricane when it made landfall. Katrina had weakened from a Category 5 storm to a Category 4 storm just before it struck the Gulf Coast. Katrina was a monster. The storm stretched about 200 miles in diameter, packed winds up to 145 miles per hour. Produced torrential rain and huge waves, spawned twisters throughout the region. And pushed up a 28-foot storm surge, a surge usually found only in Category 5 hurricanes. Katrina moved ashore on the Gulf Coast on Monday, August 29. In anticipation of the hurricane. New Orleans, which sits below sea level, had been evacuated. But there were still tens of thousands who stayed out of necessity, such as law enforcement and healthcare workers. Because they were unable to evacuate, or because they chose not to leave. Some 23,000 of those who stayed holed up in the aging Superdome Sports Arena, which was set up as an emergency shelter. The structure barely withstood the lashing winds of Katrina, which blew off portions of the dome. On Tuesday morning, after Katrina ravaged Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, before weakening as it moved inland. Officials and news reporters generally agreed that there was unbelievable damage all along the coast. But New Orleans had dodged a bullet. The Big Easy had not taken the worst of it. Gulfport and Biloxi, Mississippi, appeared the hardest hit. The devastation there was astonishing. As reports of damage began to be made, it became clear that about 90% of the structures along the Gulf Coast were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced by Katrina. The death toll was not known, and officials conceded it would take time to determine. The storm had been so ruinous of biblical proportions. Some said that rescue and recovery would take weeks and months. Later, when the full extent of damage began to be discovered, the recovery estimates were revised to years. Later Tuesday, New Orleans' fate changed. Levees that protect the city could not hold back a swollen Lake Pontchartrain. 80% of the city filled with water, 25 feet deep. Officials and volunteers could not get flood victims out fast enough. Usually plucking them from rooftops or finding them in attics, where survivors sought refuge as waters rose. The city descended into chaos and lawlessness. Heart-wrenching images of human despair filled the media, touching people around the nation. Americans responded with donations of money, goods, and time. The American Red Cross launched the largest mobilization effort in its history. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, a part of the Department of Homeland Security (DHS). The Coast Guard, also part of the DHS, and the U.S. military struggled to keep pace with Katrina's aftermath all along the coast. For all the effort, It was widely acknowledged that the government's response to the disaster was inadequate and late. On Friday, September 2, President George W. Bush said that the results had been unacceptable. He further promised to make it right. While politicians and the people spoke out on the subject, some experts said the catastrophe had simply overwhelmed the system. Emergency programs across the nation had been set up to rely on local and state response first, backed by the federal government. In Katrina's case, the devastation was so great that the localities and states either were not able to respond at all or could not respond with enough help. Federal intervention had been needed sooner and in greater measure to alleviate human suffering and protect lives. Government officials all seemed of one accord. However, the fact-finding could wait, the victims could not. Cities and states across the nation sent resources to the Gulf Coast and set up emergency centers to receive storm refugees, whose needs were immediate: water, food, clothing, shelter, medicine, healthcare, and counseling, and long-term, jobs, schools, and permanent housing. On Wednesday, September 7, 9 days after Katrina struck, the situation continued to unfold. The size and scope of the tragedy remained to be fully understood. New Orleans ordered a forced evacuation of the holdouts. The city remained flooded with toxic floodwaters as repairs were made in the levees and the hazardous water began to be pumped out. Efforts to reunite families, separated in the chaos, were ongoing. For many days, rescue workers all along the Gulf Coast had moved from house to house to find survivors. Now it was a matter of trying to identify and count the dead. The death toll was expected to be in the thousands. The affected area was 90,000 square miles, or about the size of Minnesota. Property damage was projected to be at least $26 billion in insured losses and perhaps twice that amount in uninsured losses. Katrina had also caused damages as it struck Florida as a Category 1 hurricane on August 26. It later moved into the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico and strengthened before striking the Gulf Coast. Katrina's aftermath was felt in every state of the Union. Volunteers shored up efforts to assist survivors who were being relocated in an effort to ease the burden on the afflicted region. Schools across the nation opened doors to displaced students. Fuel prices skyrocketed and natural gas and heating oil prices promised to follow, as offshore rigs and Gulf Coast refineries suffered. And most Americans worried about the government's response to the catastrophe. The disaster made an impact around the world as well, with some 95 countries offering assistance. Before Katrina, the deadliest hurricane to strike the United States was an unnamed Category 4 storm that struck Galveston, Texas, in 1900. The September 8 storm claimed at least 8,000 lives. Some estimates place the number as high as 12,000. Hurricane strength is measured on the Saffir-Simpson scale, where Category 1 is the weakest. With sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour and a storm surge of 4 to 5 feet above normal, and Category 5 is the strongest. with sustained winds of more than 155 miles per hour and a storm surge higher than 18 feet. The United States has been hit by 3 Category 5 storms since record-keeping began. The first was a Labor Day hurricane, which struck the Florida Keys in 1935, 408 people died. The second was Camille, which hit Mississippi and southeast Louisiana in 1969, claiming 256 lives. Hurricane Andrew, which struck South Miami-Dade County, Florida. In late August 1992, was measured as a Category 4 storm at the time, but the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency NOAA reclassified it in 2002 as a Category 5 storm. Andrew claimed more than 100 lives and devastated a wide area, mostly around the town of Homestead, Florida.
Who were the hippies?
Most hippies of the 1960s and 1970s were young, 15 to 25 years old, white, and from middle-class families. The counterculture, anti-establishment, movement advocated peace, love, and beauty. Having dropped out of modern society, and tuned in to their own feelings. These flower children were as well known for their political and social beliefs as they were for their controversial lifestyle. They opposed American involvement in the Vietnam War, 1954-75, and rejected an industrialized society that seemed to care only about money. They favored personal simplicity, sometimes living in small communes where possessions and work were shared, or living an itinerant lifestyle, in which day-to-day responsibilities were few if any. They wore tattered jeans and bright clothing usually of natural fabrics, grew their hair, braided beads into their locks, walked around barefoot or in sandals, and listened to a new generation of artists including the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Bob Dylan, and Joan Baez. Some hippies were also known for their drug use, experimenting with marijuana and LSD. Some hoped to gain profound insights or even achieve salvation through the drug experience, something hippie guru Timothy Leary told them was possible. New York City's East Village and San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood became havens of the counterculture. The movement began on American soil, but was soon embraced elsewhere as well, principally Canada and Great Britain.
What was the Beat movement?
The post-World War II era bred unprecedented prosperity and an uneasy pace in the United States. Out of this environment rose the Beat generation. Alienated youths who rejected society's new materialism and threw off its square attitudes to reinvent cool. The Beat generation of the 1950s bucked convention, embraced iconoclasm, and attracted attention. Mainstream society viewed them as anarchists and degenerates. But many American youths listened to and read the ideas of its leaders, including writers Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, whose novel On the Road, 1957, was the Bible of the Beat movement. William Burroughs, and Lawrence Ferling Hetty. The Beatniks, as they were dubbed by their critics, believed in peace, civil rights, and radical protest as a vehicle for change. They also embraced drugs, mystical, Eastern, religions, and sexual freedom, all controversial ideas during the post-war era. Beat writers and artists found their homes in communities like San Francisco's North Beach, Los Angeles's Venice Beach, and New York City's Greenwich Village. The movement merged, or some would argue, gave birth to the counterculture movements of the 1960s, including the hippies. Beat literature is the movement's legacy.
How old is the AFL-CIO?
The roots of the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations. AFL-CIO, today a federation of national unions. Date to 1881, when the Federation of Organized Trade and Labor Unions was formed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, by trade union leaders representing some 50,000 members in the United States and Canada. Reorganizing in 1886, the Association of Unions changed its name to the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and elected Samuel Gompers, 1850 to 1924, president. Unlike the open membership policy of the Knights of Labor, from whom the AFL gained numerous members in 1886, the AFL determined to organize by craft. At the outset, its member unions included a total of 140,000 skilled laborers. Gompers, who immigrated from England in 1863 and became the first registered member of the Cigar Makers International Union in 1864, had been active in labor for more than 2 decades. Once chosen as president of the AFL, Gompers remained in that office, with the exception of only 1 year, until his death in 1924. During the nearly 40-year period, he shaped the Labor Federation and helped it make strides by determining a general policy that allowed member unions autonomy. Unlike the Knights of Labor, which pursued long-term goals such as Knights leader Terence Powderly's abstract objective of making every man his own master, every man his own employer, the AFL focused its efforts on specific, short-term goals such as higher wages, shorter hours, and the right to bargain collectively, when an employer agrees to negotiate with workers/union representatives. In the 1890s, the AFL was weakened by labor violence, which evoked public fears. A July 1892 strike at the Carnegie Steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, turned into a riot between angry steel workers and Pinkerton guards. The militia was called in to monitor the strike, which 5 months later ended in failure for the AFL-affiliated steel workers. Nevertheless, under Gompers's leadership, membership of the AFL grew to more than 1 million by 1901 and to 2.5 million by 1917, when it included 111 national unions and 27,000 local unions. The federation collected dues from its members, creating a fund to aid striking workers. The organization avoided party politics, instead seeking out and supporting advocates regardless of political affiliation. The AFL worked to support the establishment of the U.S. Department of Labor, 1913, which administers and enforces statutes promoting the welfare and advancement of the American workforce, and the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, eventually delivering a blow to monopolies. The CIO was founded in 1938. In the early 1930s, several AFL unions banded together as the Committee for Industrial Organization and successfully conducted campaigns to sign up new members in mass production facilities such as the automobile, steel, and rubber industries. Since these initiatives, which resulted in millions of new members, were against the AFL policy of signing up only skilled laborers by craft, the CIO had reached out to all industrial workers. Regardless of skill level or craft, a schism resulted within the AFL. The unions that had participated in the CIO membership drive were expelled from the AFL. The CIO established itself as a federation in 1938, officially changing its name to the Congress of Industrial Organizations. In 1955, amidst a climate of increasing anti-unionism, the AFL and CIO rejoined to form one strong voice. Today the organization has craft and industrial affiliates at the international, national, state, and local levels, with membership totaling in the millions.
Who was Cesar Chavez?
Mexican-American farm worker Cesar Chavez, 1927 to 1993. Was a labor union organizer and spokesperson of the poor. Born in Arizona, his family lost their farm when he was just 10 years old. They became migrant workers in California, where farm production, particularly of grape crops, depended on the temporary laborers. Chavez knew the migrant workers' life intimately, and as a young man he began working to improve conditions for his people. In 1962 he organized California grape pickers into the National Farm Workers Association. 4 years later this union merged with another to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or UFWOC. The name was changed to the United Farm Workers of America, or UFW, in 1973. An impassioned speaker known for squishing bunches of grapes in his hands as he delivered his messages, Chavez went on to lead a nationwide boycott of table grapes, since growers had refused to accept the collective bargaining of the UFWOC. By the close of the 1970s, California growers of all crops had accepted the Migrant Workers Union, now called the United Farm Workers. Like Martin Luther King Jr., Chavez maintained that nonviolent protest was the key to achieving change.
How old is nationalism?
Nationalism, a people's sense that they belong together as a nation because of a shared history and culture, and often because of a common language and/or religion, emerged at the close of the Middle Ages, 500–1350. By the 1700s several countries, notably England, France, and Spain, had developed as nation-states. Groups of people with a shared background who occupy a land that is governed independently. As political and economic entities, the nation-states were preceded by fiefs, tribes, city-states, and empires, which overlapped each other as organizing units, dividing people's loyalties. By the 1800s nationalism had become a powerful force, and the view took hold that any national group has the right to form its own state. Because of this belief, called national self-determination, some nations achieved independence, including Greece, which gained freedom from Turkey in 1829, and Belgium, which won self-rule from the Netherlands in 1830. Others formed new, larger countries. Both Italy and Germany were created by the unification of numerous smaller states, Italy in 1870 and Germany 1 year later. And still others carved smaller states out of great empires, for example, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following World War I 1914–18 resulted in the formation of the independent countries of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and, later, Yugoslavia. In the United States, nationalism in the 1800s took the form of Manifest Destiny, the mission to expand the country's boundaries to include as much of North America as possible. By the end of the century, the United States had claimed all of its present-day territory. While nationalism is a source of pride and patriotism and has had many positive results, some leaders, notably German dictator Adolf Hitler 1889–1945, have carried it to extremes, initiating large-scale movements that resulted in the persecution of other peoples and in the hideous practice of ethnic cleansing. The boundary lines that were drawn on the world map at the end of the 20th century were largely the result of nationalistic movements, some of which had resulted in conflicts and some of which remained unresolved.
What happened to the hippies?
The conflict in Vietnam ended, flower children grew older. Drugs took their toll on some, and by 1980 there was no such thing as free love. Still, a few continued to lead an alternative lifestyle, while at the opposite end of the spectrum others bought back into the establishment. Still others adapted their flower child beliefs to the ever-changing world around them and got on with their lives, working at jobs and raising children in the most socially and politically conscious way possible.
Who were the Wobblies?
The Wobblies were the early radical members of the industrial workers of the world. IWW, a union founded in 1905 by the leaders of 43 labor organizations. The group pursued short-term goals via strikes and acts of sabotage as well as the long-term goal of overthrowing capitalism and rebuilding society based on socialist principles. One IWW organizer proclaimed that the final aim is revolution. Their extremist views and tactics attracted national attention, making IWW and Wobblies household terms during the early decades of the 20th century. Founded and led by miner and socialist William Big Bill Haywood. 1869 to 1928, and mine workers agitator Mary Mother Jones, 1830 to 1930, the IWW aimed to unite all workers in a camp, mine, or factory for the eventual takeover of the industrial facility. The Union organized strikes in lumber and mining camps in the West, in the steel mills of Pennsylvania, and in the textile mills of New England. The leadership advocated the use of violence to achieve its revolutionary goals and opposed mediation. Negotiations moderated by a neutral third party, collective bargaining. Bargaining between worker representatives and an employer, and arbitration, third-party mediation. The group declined during World War I, 1914-18. When the IWW led strikes that were suppressed by the federal government. The organization's leaders were arrested and the organization weakened. Haywood was convicted of sedition, inciting resistance to lawful authority, but managed to escape the country. He died in the Soviet Union, where he was given a hero's burial for his socialist views. The IWW never rose again to the prominent status of its early, controversial days. Many accounts of the group's history cite its demise in the 1920s. But, according to its own statement, the organization continued to enjoy a more or less continuous existence into the 21st century. As the IWW prepared to celebrate its 100th anniversary in 2005, it continued to promote its original goal of organizing workers by industry rather than trade. Under the IWW's scheme, workers around the world would organize into one big union divided into 6 camps or departments: agriculture and fisheries, mining and minerals, general construction, manufacture and general production, transportation and communication, and public service. In the early 2000s, the IWW had a few dozen member unions in the United States, as well as branches in Australia, Japan, Canada, and the British Isles.
What were the harshest blizzards to hit the United States?
Regions of the United States, particularly the Great Plains, Midwest, and New England, typically experience extreme winter weather, but some storms do stand out. In March 1888, the Northeast was hit by a blizzard dubbed the Great White Hurricane. After a warm spell that had caused the buds to open on trees in New York's Central Park. On March 12, the temperature in the city plummeted to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds off the Atlantic built up to 48 miles per hour. bringing unpredicted snow that continued intermittently until the early morning of March 14. The 3-day accumulation totaled 20.9 inches, and snowdrifts 15 to 20 feet high halted traffic. The snowfall was even greater elsewhere, averaging 40 inches or more in parts of southeastern New York and southern New England. The storm extended down into Chesapeake Bay, isolating the nation's capital from the world for more than a day. 200 ships were lost or grounded, and at least 100 died at sea. A total of at least 400 people died, half of them in New York City alone. Just 2 months before this nor'easter, another blizzard had swept through the Great Plains, moving eastward into Minnesota. There, high winds, blowing snow, and sudden drops in temperature combined to make it a dangerous storm, killing many people and thousands of cattle. The Great Blizzard of 1993 caused loss of life and extensive damage all along the eastern seaboard, from Maine to Florida. More than 300 people died, almost 50 of them at sea, and economic losses totaled $3 to $6 billion. While several so-called 100-year storms have bombarded the East Coast in the 1990s alone, there had been another just a few months earlier, in December 1992. The statistics of the March 1993 storm are impressive indeed, probably qualifying it as the storm of the century. Wind gusts exceeded 75 miles per hour all along the East Coast, with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour were measured at various points, including Flat Top, North Carolina. Tennessee saw the highest snowfall of the storm, with 56 inches at Mount LeConte. Snowfall amounts were also heavy in the Northeast, but snow accumulated as far south as the Florida Panhandle. Experts estimated that the amount of water that fell, in the form of snow, was equivalent to 40 days' flow of the mighty Mississippi River past New Orleans. According to record low barometer readings, this storm surpassed Hurricanes Hugo, 1989, and Hazel, 1954. However, Midwesterners and residents of the northern Great Plains could argue that storms such as the Great Blizzard of 1993 are relatively common in their regions. To wit, another storm that could easily vie for the title storm of the century occurred January 10 to 11, 1975. In the upper Midwest, the blizzard was accompanied by winds of 90 miles per hour and wind chills as low as -80 degrees Fahrenheit. Trains were stranded in snowdrifts, and at least 80 people died. Ranchers and farmers were hard hit, losing some 55,000 head of livestock.
What have been the deadliest tropical storms in the world?
The deadliest tropical storms are not hurricanes but rather the unnamed supercyclones that sweep out of the Bay of Bengal. In the Indian Ocean, striking the densely populated Indian subcontinent. These storms have been known to kill 100,000 people or more. The fatalities numbered more than 300,000 when a 1970 cyclone struck East Pakistan, Bangladesh. That storm is still the deadliest cyclone to hit the region. But more recent Indian cyclones, which usually occur in April through June and September through November, have sometimes reached supercyclone status. An April 1991 storm packing 160-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves swept over Bangladesh's low-lying coastal plain. There was no place for residents to seek shelter from the advancing sea. An estimated 140,000 people perished and 10 million were left homeless. Property damage climbed to more than $2 billion. In October 1999, another devastating cyclone struck the Bay of Bengal region. It was the strongest and deadliest since the 1991 disaster. 10,000 died and more than 1 million people lost their homes.
What was the Johnstown flood?
The city of Johnstown, in southwest Pennsylvania, east of Pittsburgh, has been the site of numerous floods, but the most disastrous one occurred on May 31, 1889, when the South Fork Dam on the Conemaugh River gave way, releasing a torrent of water. Since the dam was located some 14 miles into the Allegheny Mountains, the waters rushed into Johnstown at a rate of 50 miles per hour. The water hit with a force strong enough to have tossed a 48-ton locomotive 1 mile. It killed more than 2,000 people. Some sources place the estimate as high as 5,000 lives lost. At the time of the flood, the city's population was about 30,000. Meaning between 6 and 16% of the population died as a result of the disaster. In 1977, Johnstown was again the site of a disastrous flood. Though advance warning systems helped minimize the loss of life to 77.
What was the anti-apartheid movement?
It was an international movement to throw out the decades-old system of racial segregation in South Africa. The word apartheid means separateness in the South African language of Afrikaans. Under apartheid, which was formalized in 1948 by the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, minority whites were given supremacy over non-whites. The system further separated non-white groups from each other so that mulattoes, those of mixed race, Asians, mostly Indians, and Native Africans were segregated. The policy was so rigid that it even separated native Bantu groups from each other. Blacks were not allowed to vote, even though they were and are the majority population. Apartheid was destructive to the society as a whole and drew protest at home and abroad. But the South African government adhered to the system, claiming it was the only way to keep peace among the country's various ethnic groups. In 1961, the government even went so far as to withdraw from the British Commonwealth in a dispute over the issue. Protesters against apartheid staged demonstrations and strikes, which sometimes became violent. South Africa grew increasingly isolated as countries opposing the system refused to trade with the apartheid government. The no-trade policy had been urged by South African civil rights leader and former Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu, 1931, who led a nonviolent campaign to end apartheid and in 1984 won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. During the 1980s, the economic boycott put pressure on the white minority South African government to repeal apartheid laws. It finally did so, and in 1991 the system of segregation was officially abolished. White South African leader F.W. de Klerk, 1936, who was elected in 1989, had been instrumental in ending the apartheid system. In April 1994, South Africa held the first elections in which blacks were eligible to vote. Not surprisingly, black South Africans won control of parliament, which in turn elected black leader Nelson Mandela, 1918, as president. De Klerk was retained as deputy president. The two men won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 for their efforts to end apartheid and give all of South Africa's peoples full participation in government. In 1996, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a panel headed by Desmond Tutu and charged with investigating the political crimes committed under apartheid, began work. Its investigations continued in 1999, with many findings proving controversial.
How much damage was done by the Great Fire of London?
The fire, which began early in the morning on Sunday, September 2, 1666, and burned for 4 days and nights, consumed 4/5 of the city, which was then walled, plus 63 acres lying just outside the city walls. The blaze began in Pudding Lane near London Bridge and quickly spread through crowded wooden houses to the Thames Wharf warehouses. The destruction included London's Guildhall, the Custom House, the Royal Exchange, and St. Paul's Cathedral. Additionally, 44 livery company halls, 86 churches, and more than 13,000 houses were destroyed. Though the fire was unquestionably disastrous, London soon rebuilt and became one of Europe's most modern cities. The fire also destroyed thousands of old buildings where lice-infested rats had lived. They were partly responsible for spreading the plague through the English city.
Has a tsunami ever hit the United States?
Yes, in fact the tallest tsunami ever recorded hit Alaska in 1964, it was 220 feet high. The March 28 event was brought on by an earthquake, the Great Alaskan Earthquake in Prince William Sound, measuring 9.2 on the Richter scale. The seismic wave, tsunami, hit the southwest part of the state and claimed 107 lives. Hawaii also sees an occasional tsunami, or giant wave. Though the most remarkable one hit the islands before they became a state. On April 1, 1946, all of the water drained from the 3-mile-wide harbor at Hilo, which was immediately followed by a tsunami that rushed on shore, destroying the waterfront. The process repeated itself twice and resulted in the death of more than 150 people in Hawaii.
Who were the Molly Maguires?
They were Irish-American coal miners in eastern Pennsylvania who organized a secret society in 1854. The Molly Maguires aimed to wage a campaign of violence against mine owners and operators. The name of the group came from a society in Ireland that used physical force to fight ruthless landlords. The American miners became determined to defeat their oppressors at all costs. Their numbers grew, and in the decade following the Civil War, 1861 to 65. The Molly Maguires were active both as agitators, and it would later be revealed, as assassins. In 1875 the group incited a coal miners' strike, which was broken by the detective work of Irish-American James McParland, 1844 to 1919. A Pinkerton guard hired by Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company to infiltrate the Molly Maguires. McParland revealed the identities of gunmen responsible for the deaths of 9 mine company foremen. Several members of the secret society were arrested, tried and convicted, in 1876, and hanged, in 1877, for the crimes. American sympathies for the plight of the miners were diminished by the headlines proclaiming the terrorist activities of the Molly Maguires. The society dissolved by 1877. Their presence, however, was long felt in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, where company police monitored activities in the mines, and effectively intimidated many miners from organizing.
What was the nonviolent Indian reform movement?
It was the movement led by Indian nationalist leader Mohandas Gandhi, 1869 to 1948. Whose methods of protest included staging boycotts, fasting, conducting prayer vigils, and visiting troubled areas in an attempt to end conflicts. Gandhi, whom the people called Mahatma, meaning great-souled, was determined to bring about change in India to bring an end to British control of the country, and to topple the ages-old caste system, the strict social structure, there. Gandhi believed that it took great courage to not engage in violence, and he began campaigns of passive resistance, which he called satyagraha, meaning firmness in truth. Gaining a wide following, Gandhi's acts of civil disobedience did bring about changes in his homeland, where he is revered as the founder of an independent India, 1947. He remained faithful to his nonviolent beliefs throughout his life. He also adhered to a firm policy of religious tolerance. It was for this reason that the spiritual and nationalist leader was killed by a Hindu extremist in 1948.
What is solidarity?
It was a worker-led movement for political reform in Poland during the 1980s, and it led to the downfall of communism. The movement was inspired by Pope John Paul II's June 1979 visit to his native Poland, where, in Warsaw, he delivered a speech to millions, calling for a free Poland and a new kind of solidarity. As scholar and author Timothy Garton Ash noted, without the Pope, no solidarity. Without solidarity, no Gorbachev. Without Gorbachev, no fall of communism. Shipyard electrician Lech Walesa, 1943, became the leader of Solidarity. Formed in 1980 when 50 labor unions banded together to protest Poland's communist government. The unions staged strikes and demonstrations. By 1981, Solidarity had gained so many followers that it threatened Poland's government, which responded, with the support of the Soviet Union, by instituting martial law in December of that year. The military cracked down on the activities of the unions, abolishing Solidarity in 1982 and arresting its leaders, including the charismatic Walesa. But the powerful People's Movement, which had also swept up farmers, who formed the rural Solidarity, could not be suppressed. Martial law was lifted in mid-1983, but the government continued to exert control over the people's freedom. That year Walesa received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to gain workers' rights and prevent violence. Solidarity continued its work for reform. In 1989, the collapse of communism on the horizon, people's movements in Eastern Europe had combined with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost to herald the system's demise. The Polish government reopened negotiations with Solidarity's leadership. Free elections were held that year, with the Labour Party candidates gaining numerous seats in parliament. In 1990, Walesa was elected president, at which time he resigned as chairman of Solidarity. Poland's Communist Party was dissolved that year.
Who was Biko?
Stephen Biko, 1946 to 1977. Was a black leader in the fight against South African apartheid and white minority rule. In 1969, Biko, who was then a medical student, founded the South African Students' Organization, which took an active role in the Black Consciousness movement, a powerful force in the fight against apartheid. Preaching a doctrine of black self-reliance and self-respect, Biko organized protests, including anti-government strikes and marches. Viewing such activities as a challenge to its authority and fearing an escalation of unrest. In August 1977, the white government had Biko arrested. Within 1 month, he died in prison. Evidence indicated he had died at the hands of his jailers. A revelation that only cemented anti-government sentiment. Along with Nelson Mandela, 1918, who was imprisoned in South Africa from 1962 to 1990 for his political activities, Biko became a symbol of the anti-apartheid movement, galvanizing support for racial justice at home and abroad.
What is Zionism?
Zionism was founded as the nationalist movement to establish an independent Jewish state. It began in the 1890s, and roughly 50 years later, in 1948. The movement's activism resulted in the proclamation of the State of Israel. Since that time, Zionism has focused its efforts on building bridges between Israel and Jewish people around the world. The roots of Zionism date to 1882, when a movement began encouraging Jewish settlement of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. Groups advocating immigration to the Jewish homeland in Palestine called themselves Lovers of Zion. Havavei Zion. Mount Zion is the site in Jerusalem where the Temple of David, king of the ancient Hebrews, d. 962 BC, was built, and it is therefore considered the center of Jewish spiritual life. As a political movement, Zionism was founded in the late 1890s by Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl, 1860 to 1904. In 1894 Herzl was among the reporters covering the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a French army officer falsely convicted of treason. Though the artillery captain, who was Jewish, was later declared innocent. The guilty verdict rendered in his first trial was annulled. Many felt the Dreyfus case had exposed a deep vein of anti-Semitism in Europe. Herzl's conclusion was that if anti-Semitism could take hold in France, it could prevail anywhere. Based on this belief, he began working for the reclamation of a Jewish state in the Middle East. In 1897 Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress, held in Basel, Switzerland, bringing the movement to worldwide attention. In 1917, against the backdrop of World War I, 1914-18, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, 1848-1930, issued a declaration vowing his country's support for a national Jewish homeland in Palestine. This came after British troops liberated the Middle East from the control of the Ottoman Empire. In 1920 the Ottoman Empire dissolved as part of the conclusion of World War I, and by international agreement the British were given rule over Palestine. Numerous Jews immigrated to Palestine, where fighting broke out with Arabs who opposed Jewish resettlement. Previously boosted by British support of an independent Jewish state, Zionists received a heavy blow in 1937 when, with another conflict in Europe on the horizon. Britain reversed its policy in Palestine in an effort to gain Arab support should fighting break out with Germany. At the end of World War II, 1939–45, Britain turned over the problem in the Middle East to the newly created United Nations, which decided that out of Palestine, both an independent Jewish state and a self-ruling Arab state should be formed. In 1948 the State of Israel was declared by Polish-born and Zionist moderate David Ben-Gurion. 1886–1973, who became head of the nation's provisional government. The World Zionist Congress was later separated from the government. The organization has since turned its attention to immigration and cultural activities. German-born scientist Albert Einstein, 1897–1955, was among Zionism's most prominent adherents.
What is the worst flood in history?
The worst flood to date occurred in China in 1887, when more than 900,000 people died as the Huanghe Yellow River overflowed. China is particularly susceptible to severe and regular flooding. The Huanghe River alone typically floods 2 out of every 3 years. And because river valleys are densely populated, the human toll is often great. A 1939 flood in North China claimed more than 500,000 lives.
Who was Eugene Debs?
Debs, 1855–1926, was a radical labor leader who in 1893 founded the American Railway Union. ARU, an industrial union for all railroad workers. Debs was a charismatic speaker. But he was also a controversial figure in American life around the turn of the century. In 1894 workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company, which manufactured rail cars in Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, went on strike to protest a significant reduction in their wages. Pullman was a model company town where the railcar manufacturer, founded by American inventor George W. Pullman, 1831–1897, in 1867, owned all the land and buildings, and ran the school, bank, and utilities. In 1893, in order to maintain profits following declining revenues, the Pullman Company cut workers' wages by 25 to 40%, but did not adjust rent and prices in the town, forcing many employees and their families into deprivation. In May 1894, a labor committee approached Pullman Company management to resolve the situation. The company, which had always refused to negotiate with employees, responded by firing the labor committee members. The firings incited a strike of all 3,300 Pullman workers. In support of the labor effort, Eugene Debs assumed leadership of the strike. Some Pullman employees had joined the ARU in 1894, and directed all ARU members not to haul any Pullman cars. A general rail strike followed, which paralyzed transportation across the country. In response to what was now being called Debs Rebellion, a July 2, 1894, federal court order demanded all workers to return to the job, but the ARU refused to comply. U.S. President Grover Cleveland, 1837 to 1908, ordered federal troops to break the strike, citing it interfered with mail delivery. The intervention turned violent. Despite public protest, Debs, who was tried for contempt of court and conspiracy, was imprisoned in 1895 for having violated the court order. Debs later proclaimed himself a socialist and became leader of the American left, running unsuccessfully for president as the Socialist Party candidate 5 times. In 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920. He actively supported the causes of the international workers of the world. IWW, a radical labor organization founded in 1905.
What happened at China's Tiananmen Square?
In 1989, Beijing's Tiananmen Square, the largest public square in the world, became the site of a student protest and massacre. 3 years before the demonstration, freedom of speech and other democratic beliefs began being espoused on university campuses. In increasing numbers, China's youth were demanding political reform. They found a sympathizer in the General Secretary, the highest-ranking officer of the Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, 1915 to 1989, who, despite criticism from conservatives in government, adhered to his liberal views, particularly concerning freedom of expression. In January 1987, Hu was removed from his post. He died in April 1989, at which time students organized marches in his honor and demonstrated in favor of democratic reforms. On June 4, 1989, Chinese troops fired on the protesters in Tiananmen Square, killing more than 200 and later arresting anyone thought to be involved in China's pro-democracy movement. The actions raised fury around the world. International observers continued to monitor the tenuous situation in China, where evidence surfaced that the government was continuing its pattern of human rights violations.
What were the effects of the Dust Bowl?
After the dust had settled in the spring of 1934, the reaction among many Great Plains farm families was to flee the devastation. More than 350,000 people packed up their belongings and headed west, their lives forever changed by the disaster. In his 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath, American writer and Nobel laureate John Steinbeck, 1902 to 1968, chronicled the harrowing and sorrowful westward journey of one Oklahoma family that was among the so-called Okies who deserted their farmlands. in the devastated area of the Great Plains in search of a better life elsewhere. Nature alone was not to blame for the Dust Bowl. By the end of the 19th century, farmers, aided by the advent of large tractors and reapers, harvesting machines, were cultivating the Great Plains. Uprooting the native buffalo grass, which holds moisture in the soil, keeping it from blowing away. Even strong winds and extended droughts had not disturbed the land when it was covered by the grassland. When the demand for wheat increased after World War I, 1914-18, farmers responded by planting more than 27 million new acres of the grain. By 1930 there were almost 3 times as many acres in wheat production as 10 years earlier. Most of the buffalo grass that had prevented the earth from blowing had been removed. When the next dry period came, in spring 1934, and the wind picked up, the Dust Bowl resulted. The government stepped in to remedy the problem. Soil conservation became the focus of federal agencies. And the U.S. Forest Service undertook a project to plant a shelter belt of trees within a 100-mile wide zone, from Canada to the Texas Panhandle. Recovery was aided by the return of the rains. Soon the buffalo grass had grown back, helping to ensure that the Dust Bowl would not recur.
When did the U.S. labor movement begin?
It began in the early 1800s, when skilled workers, such as carpenters and blacksmiths, banded together in local organizations with the goal of securing better wages. By the time fighting broke out in the Civil War, 1861-65, the first national unions had been founded again, by skilled workers. However, many of these early labor organizations struggled to gain widespread support and soon fell apart. But by the end of the century, several national unions, including the United Mine Workers, 1890, and the American Railway Union, 1893, emerged. In the last 2 decades of the 1800s, violence accompanied labor protests and strikes while opposition to the unions mounted. Companies shared blacklists of the names of workers suspected of union activities, hired armed guards to forcibly break strikes, and retained lawyers to successfully invoke the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, to crush strikes. Lawyers argued that strikes interfered with interstate commerce, which was declared illegal by the Sherman legislation, which had not been the intent of the lawmakers. In the early decades of the 1900s, unions made advances. But many Americans continued to view organizers and members as radicals. The climate changed for the unions during the Great Depression, 1929-39. With so many Americans out of work, many blamed business leaders for the economy's failure and began to view the unions in a new light as organizations to protect the interests of workers. In 1935, the federal government strengthened the union's cause in passing the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act, protecting the rights to organize and to bargain collectively. When worker representatives, usually labor union representatives, negotiate with employers. The legislation also set up the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, which still works today to penalize companies that engage in unfair labor practices. The constitutionality of the act was challenged in court in 1937. But the Supreme Court upheld the legislation. The unions grew increasingly powerful over the next decade. By 1945, more than one-third of all non-agricultural workers belonged to a union. Having made important gains during World War II, 1939–45, including hospital insurance coverage, paid vacations and holidays, and pensions, union leaders continued to urge workers to strike to gain more ground, something leaders felt was the workers' right amidst the unprecedented prosperity of the post-war era. But strikes soon impacted the life of the average American. Consumers faulted the unions for shortages of consumer goods, suspension of services, and inflated prices. Congress responded by passing the Labor Management Relations Act, or the Taft-Hartley Act, in 1947, which limits the impact of unions by prohibiting certain kinds of strikes, setting rules for how unions could organize workers, and establishing guidelines for how strikes that may impact the nation's health or safety are to be handled.
What was the impact of the fire at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas?
The November 21, 1980, blaze, which killed 85 people and injured more than 600, led to a nationwide revision of local fire codes, giving the tragic event large-scale political significance. The MGM Grand Hotel had, in fact, passed fire inspections, but the building, which was then the world's largest gambling casino, had been 8 years in the making. Between the time it was designed, fire protection systems included, and the time it was built, the building no longer complied with the always improving safety standard for high-rise buildings. A short circuit started the blaze, which sent thick black smoke through the air ducts and escape stairwells. In the 21 floors of guest rooms, since more people were harmed or killed by smoke inhalation than by the fire itself, the American public became aware of the danger of smoke over and above that of fire. The event was a catalyst for change. Prior to the November blaze, most communities had not required existing buildings to be retrofitted every time fire safety codes changed and improved. After the fire, many communities chose to require building owners to comply with current protection capabilities.
How does the Great Flood of 1993 compare with other floods?
The flood, which occurred in the summer of 1993, was immense. So much of Iowa was underwater that a satellite image, monitoring moisture on the earth, made the flooded area look like it was the size of Lake Michigan or Lake Superior. The area that was underwater was roughly equivalent to twice the size of Massachusetts. Even so, the Great Flood resulted in a smaller water-covered area than did floods earlier in the century, in 1926 and 1973. Due to heavy rainfall during the spring and summer of 1993, the Mississippi River widened to as much as 7 miles at some points, and the Missouri River also overflowed its banks despite the levee system that had been put in place by the federal government earlier in the century. The flood took 50 lives, displaced 85,000 people from their homes, destroyed 8,000 homes, damaged the contents of another 20,000 homes, stranded 2,000 loaded barges, and resulted in just more than 400 counties being declared disaster areas. The property and crop losses totaled $15 billion.
What was the Dust Bowl?
The Dust Bowl was the most severe drought in U.S. history. In the spring of 1934, the country in the grips of the Great Depression. Farmers across the Great Plains of the United States witnessed two great dust storms. First, in mid-April, after days of hot, dry weather and cloudless skies, 40 to 50 mile-per-hour winds picked up and took with them the dry soil, resulting in thick, heavy clouds. In Texas and Oklahoma, these dirt clouds engulfed the landscape. The next month was extremely hot. And on May 10 the second storm came up as the gales returned, this time creating a light brown fog. On May 11 experts estimated that 12 million tons of soil fell on Chicago as the dust storm blew in off the Great Plains. And the same storm darkened the skies over Cleveland. On May 12 the dust clouds had reached the eastern seaboard. Between the two storms, 650 million tons of topsoil had blown off the plains. The resulting dust bowl covered 300,000 square miles across New Mexico, eastern Colorado, Texas, western Oklahoma, and Kansas. The damage was great. Crops, principally wheat, were cut off at ground level or torn from their roots. Cattle that ate dust-laden grass eventually died from mud balls. Dust drifted, creating banks against barns and houses, while families tried to keep it from penetrating the cracks and crevices of their homes by using wet blankets, oiled cloths, and tape, only to still have everything covered in grit. Vehicles and machinery were clogged with dirt. In addition to the farmers who died in the fields, suffocated by the storm, hundreds of people suffered from dust pneumonia.
What are Nader's Raiders?
They were, and are, investigators working with American lawyer and consumer advocate Ralph Nader, 1934. With the help of his research team, Nader wrote the landmark work Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965. It charged that many automobiles weren't as safe as they should be or as consumers had the right to expect them to be. In part, the book was responsible for passage in 1966 of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which set motor vehicle safety standards. Nader has continued his watchdog work, founding the Public Citizen Organization, which researches consumer products, promotes consumer awareness, and works to influence legislators to improve consumer safety. While Nader may be the most recognizable face of consumer advocacy, the movement's roots predate his activism. As the consumer age dawned at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, when mass production techniques came into wide use, some observers decried industry standards, or lack thereof, that put the public who used their products at risk. The muckraking journalists of the early 20th century disclosed harmful or careless practices of early industry, raising awareness and bringing about needed reforms. Upton Sinclair, 1878 to 1968, for example, penned the highly influential novel The Jungle, 1906, revealing scandalous conditions of meatpacking plants. The public was outraged upon reading Sinclair's work. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, ordered an investigation, finding the novelist's descriptions to be true to life. Government moved quickly to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act that same year, 1906. Industry watchdogs continued their work in the early decades of the century. In 1929, Consumers Research Inc. was founded, and in 1936, the Consumers Union was formed. Both of these independent organizations test and rate consumer products. Consumers Union publishes its reports in the monthly magazine Consumer Reports. Such consumer advocacy has served to heighten public awareness, compelling industry to make changes and improving the safety of products in general. Abuses still occur, but at roughly 100 years into the consumer age. The work of consumer watchdogs like Nader's Raiders has made the consumer experience far less risky than it once was.
What was the May 4th movement?
It was a mass movement that emerged in China after May 4, 1919, when students in Beijing protested one of the outcomes of the peace conference held at Versailles earlier that year to officially settle World War I, 1914-18 Japan, which had seized German territories in China during the war, was given control of the holdings. Student demonstrators criticized a weakened Chinese government for allowing the Japanese occupation. Following the death of powerful leader Yuan Shikai, 1859-1916, the country's central government crumbled. In northern China, local military leaders, called warlords, rose to power, continually challenging the authority of the capital at Beijing. Meanwhile, revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen, 1866-1925, had begun promoting his three great principles: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood in southern China, where he gained the support of military leaders in the region. At about the same time, Chinese intellectuals had begun attacking traditional culture and society, urging government reforms and the modernization of industry. The May 4th movement fanned the fires of revolution. The movement would have far-reaching and unforeseen results. And some might argue that the story has not yet played out. In 1919, Sun reorganized the Kuomintang, nationalist, party and began recruiting student followers. 2 years later he became president of a self-proclaimed national government of the Southern Chinese Republic, establishing the capital at Guangzhou, Canton. His sights were set on conquering northern China, toppling the northern warlords to reunify the country. In 1924 Sun began cooperating with both the Soviets and the communist groups that had been formed by students following the 1919 protest. Under Sun's leadership, the Nationalist Party began preparing for war. But Sun, who is regarded as the father of modern China, would not live to see the culmination of his plans. He died of cancer in 1925. Under military leader Chiang Kai-shek, 1887 to 1975. The Kuomintang turned on its communist members, whose leaders fled in fear of the Generalissimo. In 1928, following a 2-year military campaign, Chiang led the nationalists to capture Beijing, reuniting China under one government for the first time in 12 years. His rule of China lasted until 1949, when communists won control of the mainland and Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, became the first chairman of the People's Republic of China. The expelled Chiang and his followers established a Chinese nationalist government on the island of Taiwan. Back on the mainland, Mao's great leap forward, his massive collectivization of agriculture and industry, brought economic failure and a 2-year famine to China in the late 1950s.